Okay, guys, so we're going to get started here, and I'm just going to go through the preliminaries and assume that a couple more people will probably trickle in the next few minutes as we get started. So thank you all for joining us today for Dr. Kristen Intemann's Professor of Philosophy's talk on Disinformation Age, Fake News, Conspiracy Theories, and the Technology that Perpetuates It. Dr. Intemann is a professor of philosophy in the Department of History and Philosophy and the director of the Initiative for Science, Technology, and Society at Montana State University. Specializing in philosophy of science and ethics, her work focuses on scientific objectivity and bias, disinformation, public understanding of and engagement with science, and issues of social justice. She's the co-author of The Fight Against Doubt, How to Bridge the Gap Between Science and the Public, with Emmanuel Cluda, the Danilo Martin, sorry, I think I botched the name,
Okay.
Oxford 2018. And so we'd like to begin this presentation, as we're beginning All Honors Presents, with a land acknowledgement. We begin by acknowledging with honor and respect the indigenous nations on whose traditional territories the university now stands, and whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We also acknowledge the elders, past and present, including MSU's current Council of Elders, and humbly ask for their guidance. The Valley of the Flowers has been, and remains, a place for learning for Native American peoples, who for millennia have passed ways of knowing, being, and doing from one generation to the next. While land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important social justice and decolonialization practice that promotes Indigenous visibility and is a reminder that we are on settled Indigenous land. And so without further ado, Dr. Intemann, I'd like to turn it over to you, and I think we're all very excited to hear what you have to say today.
Okay, great. I'm going to try to start sharing my screen here. As I do that, I want to actually start today by also giving a shout out to our veterans. So thank any of you who are veterans or who may be family members of veterans. Obviously, also family members make lots of sacrifices when a member of their family serves in our military. And so thank you. And thank all of you, because I know that it's a kind of crazy time in the semester, and that a lot of you are probably preparing for finals and things like that. And not to mention, it's been such a crazy semester with everything going on and in this halfway virtual world. So thanks for coming. As Atticus mentioned, and thanks to Atticus for helping to organize this talk, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about disinformation, and in particular things like fake news, conspiracy, and I'm going to focus on some of the ways in which technology actually perpetuates this problem. And I'm going to here's what we're going to try to do. And I'm going to try to also keep it short so that we have lots of time for discussion, because I imagine you have lots of ideas. So I'm going to try to clarify different kinds of ways in which information gets undermined, right? We often think of fake news, but really the ways in which information can be misleading is a lot more complicated than that. And then we'll talk about technology, and in particular social media, how that plays a role in the creation and dissemination of information that's not reliable, potentially. And then we can have a discussion about what to do about it, which is the hard part, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to talk about that for a bit. When Atticus first talked to me about giving this talk, I had originally hoped to do it before the election, because of course, during the election season, we saw lots of examples of potentially misleading political ads, for example, and really at every level of political races and from all across the political spectrum. And I thought, oh, right after the election, it won't be so important. But it turns out that just even within the past few days and hours, there's been a kind of explosion of what is potentially disinformation, misleading claims, unsubstantiated claims, things taken out of context. And so, claims about there being fraud and widespread fraud in the election, I believe the photo on the right is, some of you may have heard, one of the claims that went around is that Dominion voting systems were potentially responsible for having counting a bunch of ballots for Biden in certain states. I think it was Georgia was the main one. It turns out that's not true. There were, I think, only 4 counties where there were several counties where there were some technical issues, and only, I think, 2 or 4 of them, between 2 and 4 of them were ones where Dominion voting systems were used. And the glitch that they had was not one that impacted counting. So, you know, these claims are obviously going to be investigated over the coming days, possibly weeks. And we'll sort of see what comes out. But at this time, you know, just beware, because there's a lot of potentially misleading claims out there. So we'll talk in a little bit about how we can try to evaluate some of those at the end. I want to start also by kind of acknowledging that when we talk about disinformation, we actually are all susceptible. It doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum we're on. It doesn't matter how educated and smart and wonderfully critically thinking we are. We all are potentially susceptible to misinformation. And that's because of several reasons, right? So one is that all of us, being human, have certain cognitive biases, right? These are well known in human psychology. Things like confirmation bias, where we tend to give more weight to evidence that coheres with our own views, our own worldviews, our own values, sometimes wishful thinking, right? We want something to be true, and so we believe it, right? We're more likely to believe it, and we're more likely to downplay evidence that cuts against that. There are also things like bandwagon effects, where we tend to quickly adopt beliefs that of those in our community or others around us. And we also all have certain kind of cognitive and practical limitations as well. So, and we can come back to this at the end, but you know, one of the challenges is we're bombarded with information all the time. And if you think very honestly with yourselves for a moment, you'll think about, you know, do you really track down and investigate every single claim that you hear, right? Whether it be from scientists or doctors or media people or your professors, right? You know, it's we are what some people have called cognitive misers, right? We have a whole bunch of things going on in our lives, and we're very busy, and sometimes we don't get to sleep very much. And so it can be very difficult to process information. We tend to do it sometimes when the stakes are higher, but oftentimes we kind of accept things just because it's easier, or we use certain heuristic devices. Like we think, okay, this is from a source I've heard of, this is from a source I know, this is from a source I trust. And so we just kind of use that little mental shortcut to accept things. And there's also very real social and emotional drivers. All of us, again, regardless of where we're at on the political spectrum, we have a desire to feel part of a community with shared values. But that also means that sometimes we are susceptible to things like tribalism, right? We tend to think, you know, my side's for this, so this is what I believe, and regardless of what the evidence is, even though sometimes, you know, that's obviously really implicit. We also get really motivated by things like anger and distrust, and so that's another thing I'm going to try to come back to a little bit later on. But those can push us towards certain beliefs, right? Independently of what evidence there is for or against them. And that's, again, we're kind of all just in the same boat with that, right? I wanted to quickly kind of go over a distinction that I think is useful. And it's not mine. This is actually from the work of Claire Wardle, who was a co-founder of First Draft, which is a sort of fact-checking, trying to address disinformation organization. She's at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And she makes this distinction, which I think is kind of useful. She thinks that there's two different ways that information can be problematic. One is it can be false or misleading, right? And there's a whole spectrum, right, where claims might fall, where they might be more false or more misleading. And then there's also potentially information can be problematic when it's used in particular ways, when it's kind of weaponized, right, with an intent to harm. So there could be, for example, claims that are false, but where there's no intent to harm. So that's the portion of this reddish peach circle that doesn't overlap with the blue. And of course, that happens all the time. I mean, sometimes, for example, the media make unintentional and honest errors. If they're reputable, they correct themselves and acknowledge that they made a mistake. And also, I mean, this could also even be things like some of my students said, oh, my grandparents forward fake news things all the time. And clearly they probably aren't intending to do that with malice, right? But it's just not true information. And sometimes over in the falseness category, we might even think of different degrees of media bias, right? So there might be media bias that is misleading. It's not necessarily intending to mislead you, but we all have certain unconscious biases and assumptions in the back of our heads, and that can certainly influence journalists in a way that leads to misleading information. It might not be intentional, right? And then on the other, in the blue circle on the other side, there's some what she calls malinformation, right? Which is information that intends to harm. Not all of it is false, right? I mean, I think this is interesting. So we focus a lot on things like fake news, but information can be misleading even if it's not false. For example, you know, if you sort of selective leaks, right? When you selectively reveal certain information, but in a way that it's decontextualized, you can't see the context, right? And so as a result, it's technically true, but not totally, right? And so, you know, that sort of thing is usually done with an intent to harm. Not all of it is false. The WikiLeaks might be a perfect example of this. So when WikiLeaks in 2016 leaked some of John Podesta and Hillary Clinton's emails, clearly it was done in a way to try to influence the election, to try to cause harm to them in particular. But, you know, a lot of people reacted to it by saying, well, it's true. So that's, you know, who cares if it was done with malintent. What I'm going to focus on is a slice that's kind of in the middle here, where both the information is false or misleading and there's kind of an intent to harm, right? This kind of disinformation. And, you know, you can probably think of some examples of this, you know, trolls in social media accounts that are even sometimes not real people, right? That simply disseminate false information to try to either sow chaos or division or create confusion about things. The tobacco industry is probably a good example of disinformation. So for a very long time, we now have seen the documents to kind of show this. They had a very deliberate strategy of trying to sow disinformation and raise doubt about the evidence between smoking and certain health effects because they were trying to stall regulation, right? So with that in mind, when we do think about fake news, which would be one kind of disinformation, right? It's important to remind ourselves that fake news is actually not new. It's been around for hundreds of years. Actually, I'm sure it's even been around longer than that. But in the US, we have a shorter history, right? So it's been around for hundreds of years. And one example is from the New York Sun in 1835. They actually did a whole series of reports about the discovery of life on the moon, right? In case you missed it, right? Apparently there are these kind of winged bat-like creatures on the moon, as well as some unicorn people. And this was, at the time, the New York Sun was an incredibly respected newspaper, right? And John Herschel was a British astronomer. And eventually, it was clear that this was not true, but they had done like a 9-article series on it. But of course, in 1835, the New York Sun didn't even reach probably all the people in New York, right? It was, kind of a regional newspaper. It certainly didn't reach everyone in the United States, and it certainly didn't reach everyone in the globe. So what's changed, and the reason why fake news has potentially become such a huge issue for all of us, is not because it's fake, but because of the way information is disseminated, right? So now through social media, through the internet, information gets disseminated at a much broader and faster rate. So, for example, some of the claims about widespread fraud in the election, even ones that were taken down or flagged as false or misleading, they had already been forwarded to tens or hundreds of thousands of people in some cases, right? And by then the damage is done. So another great example is the Flat Earth Society. So, the Flat Earth Society, believe it or not, has actually been around for quite a long time. And I think it took them, almost 150 years to get about 3,500 members worldwide, right? Starting in around 1850. But now, once the internet and social media happened, the popularity of the Flat Earth Society took off. Now, just in case you have no idea what I'm talking about, right? The Flat Earth Society is a group that believes that the Earth is in fact flat. And that, the moon landing and all these other things, the photos of the Earth from space, are, completely fabricated. It's a huge conspiracy. NASA's in on it, right? And indeed, we're in more like kind of a terrarium, right? Where the Earth is flat and there's a terrarium on top of us, and the sun and moon kind of revolve around the top. And some flat earthers believe there's like a wall of ice, think Game of Thrones, right? Like that giant wall of ice, right? That goes around. And so what's interesting is, even though it took so long for this view to catch on through the internet and social media, they now have, their YouTube videos get millions of views. Their Facebook pages get hundreds of thousands of likes, right? And they now have things like international conferences and all sorts of things. So this has really taken off potentially. Some of you might remember, although this now kind of feels a little bit like ancient history, right? But some of you might remember Pizzagate. It has been a little bit morphed now into some of the views held by some members of QAnon. But this idea that certain Democratic leaders, including Hillary Clinton, were running a kind of a child sex ring, exploiting children out of the basement of a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C., right? And indeed, this is the pizza place in DC. It's just kind of your average family pizza place. And the Pizzagate news, the view that this was happening became so entrenched that in Edgar Allan Welch, who was a 29-year-old from North Carolina, he was appalled by this, right? I mean, who wouldn't be if you believe it's true that there's these powerful people doing horrific things to children in a public restaurant in downtown DC or whatever, right? He went there armed with several weapons and shot through, I think, a refrigerator where somebody was making pizza dough. He fired off a couple of shots, but then he realized that, in fact, the pizzeria didn't even have a basement, right? There were definitely no children there. There was nobody to rescue. But as you might imagine, he scared a lot of people in the process. And so the police came and he actually surrendered to the FBI immediately and admitted that his intel had been, kind of iffy, right? But this really goes to show that information can be incredibly powerful, right? It really can cause us to act, and very negative consequences can happen if we're not careful. So one question we might ask is, how is it that Pizzagate happened? How is it that all these people believe that there's this pedophile sex ring, in the basement of a pizza place that doesn't even have a basement, right? So it all started sort of in the corners of the web. And actually, investigators have now found several different, what we might call seeds of the Pizzagate story. One of them happened from this Facebook user, Carmen Katz, on Facebook in late October of 2016. And so all she did was post on her Facebook page, right? My NYPD source says it's much more vile and serious than the material classified on Weiner's device. That's Anthony Weiner, the former New York congressman. The email detail the trips made by these, by Democrats, right, and their pedophile billionaire friend, who presumably is Jeffrey Epstein. And yes, it's well documented. Hillary Clinton has a predilection for underage girls. We're talking international child enslavement and sex ring. So this went viral. Now, how does that happen? Who the heck is Carmen Katz, right? I mean, none of my Facebook posts go viral, although most of them, involve mountains, posts about mountains. So that's probably why. So, I want to kind of clue you into the way in which these kinds of stories get spread. So this is kind of interest. This is interesting. First, what happens is that actors, often with bad intentions, right, trying to create chaos, trying to create confusion, right, seed false information, usually on anonymous chat boards, right? And so some of the examples of this are, 4chan, 8chan, Reddit, 3rant. 3rant is actually one, an anonymous board that's used by police officers, law enforcement officers in New York City. And so somebody will just make a post like that woman did, or say, I have a source in the NYPD department that these emails that were found by Hillary Clinton show, they talk about pizza, and pizza's code for child, and they're ordering a pizza, right? So they seed this information, and then what happens is that, there's an encouragement to get the message out there, right? So they encourage participants there to kind of pick it up and repost it on other platforms that are not anonymous, right? Things like Facebook, things like Twitter, things like Parler now, right? So, and what they do is the stories end up getting amplified through certain coalesced political groups and influencers. So people belong to certain groups on Facebook with a set of shared values that obviously might cohere with this particular kind of story. And again, this can happen on either side of the political spectrum. This is an example where it happened kind of in more conservative circles, right? But they have these kind of political influencers. I'm going to give you an example of this. That then get picked up by people who have many, many, many followers. And so what happened is one of the strings that they traced back Pizzagate to was they found an original anonymous post that was on 3rant that was then reposted on a law enforcement Facebook group that then got picked up by a conservative influencer on Twitter, who among her followers were people like Sebastian Gorka and Michael Flynn. And from there, it also went to InfoWars and Breitbart and some of the other, so you can kind of see how it just kind of balloons out, right? And what's interesting is some of the people who are, influencers, this is the example of the person who retweeted the Pizzagate story. These accounts are strange because this is an individual who's tweeted 50,000 times in less than 2 years, right? Now, I'll admit I'm not a Twitter person. You guys are, presumably a lot of you. But my students say that's a lot. That's a lot. That's somebody tweeting a lot. But as you know, that sometimes you can put settings on your Twitter account that it automatically retweets or resends posts that have, for example, certain keywords. And so some of this is kind of semi-automated, presumably, right? In a way that then ends up getting you lots and lots of followers when you're tweeting on that kind of thing. But it was pretty striking, some of the high-profile people that followed this, this account. So, and this is a quote from Ben NIMMO from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, who kind of tracked how some of this happens. And so I think this just really explains it nicely. So he writes, a message that someone or some organization wants to trend is typically sent out by shepherd accounts, right? In this case, ego wings, that often have large followings and are controlled by humans, by actual people, but they get amplified by sheepdog accounts, which are run by humans, but can be default set to kind of boost the signal. And you can also set it to harass critics. So if anyone doesn't like your post, you can automatically send a mean tweet or post to them, right? So the next time you're arguing with somebody on Twitter, just know you might actually be arguing with a robot, right? Not a human. You might be arguing with an automated setting. So at times, the shepherds personally steer conversations, but they also deploy automation, a kind of Twitter cruise control to retweet particular keywords and hashtags. So together, NIMMO says that shepherds and sheepdogs guide a herd of bots, which are fully automated accounts, and they just mindlessly repost content which is sort of the digital equivalent of sheep rushing in the same direction and bleating loudly, right? So, you know, I wanted to at least give you an idea of how it is that these stories, even when they don't have a lot of evidence behind them, can get picked up, amplified, and spread incredibly rapidly. But this isn't the only problem. So I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary that's on Netflix right now, The Social Dilemma. I highly recommend it, even though it's incredibly depressing. So maybe wait for the right moment to watch it. But I think it does a nice job of capturing how social media platforms work. And of course, the business model that they're run on is one where they need engagement. They need to keep you engaged. They need to keep you checking your phone. They need to keep you checking your tablet, you know, checking your Twitter account, checking your Facebook account. Well, you guys probably don't use, checking your TikTok, whatever. So, you know, and engaging, liking, disliking, forwarding, sharing posts, right? Doing all of those kinds of things where and they're tracking you and they're trying to gear you towards
me to sit here, or shall I go sit in my office?
No,
I'll probably your office because you're on there. That's fine.
No, Dean Lee, could you mute yourself?
But I don't know how to do
My
it.
apologies.
That's okay. That's okay.
okay.
It happens. So anyway, the thing is that these algorithms start to push us. So every time, for example, we look at something in Google search, if you notice, you get suggestions, like when you go and visit web pages, you get suggestions. And I can always tell that the algorithms are working on me because, I don't know, if I'm doing a talk on CRISPR and I'm looking for various articles on CRISPR, all of a sudden in my Google newsfeed, I have like all these suggestions coming up that are CRISPR related, right? So, but those algorithms then push us, right? Push us in directions of information they think we want. But the effect that has, right, is that it ends up kind of tracking us into particular information silos where we're only getting access to information that they think we want, right? And we're not necessarily getting all perspectives on a view. And interestingly, research has shown that one of the most effective ways to get people to engage is, drumroll, anger. So you're often driven to content that is trying to deliberately elicit a particular emotion from you. One that either makes you really angry or one that humor is another one. So things we think that are pretty funny. But you know, that doesn't mean we're getting the best information. And this is when you also can have the echo chamber effect where you know, we hear other people saying things that seem right to us and that we agree with and that we like, and that gets reinforced all the time. And then we wonder, how could that other group that are different from us possibly believe these crazy other things, right? But it's because we haven't had access to the same kind of information that they have often on social media. So what can we do to kind of thwart the influence of these kind of algorithms? We can kind of counter their influence. We can force ourselves to go to many different sites. I actually deliberately do this on my phone. I sometimes will deliberately go to a really broad range of political perspectives. So I'll look at like Red State News and Mother Jones and, you know, MSNBC and Fox News, and, you know, they don't know what to do with me, right? Because they're like, what is this? We've never seen, this is weird. But that way I end up actually getting suggestions from a lot of different perspectives in a way that kind of balances that out. Of course, that takes a lot of time, sadly, right? To read all that stuff. So, you know, that's hard. Another option is to kind of resist them, or at least think very carefully about how you're using social media. You know, there was a study by Pew Research that showed that people who are under 30 are increasingly getting most of their news from social media. You know, some of that may be like, you know, if you're following if you're following a news site, maybe, but I would just say be really careful to not get news on social media. Go directly to the source or the site. If you know, it's better than doing it through social media. At the very least, you're giving them less information about yourself. And even though it's hard, you know, really think critically about what you're liking, what you're commenting on, what you're sharing, because again, all that's being used to track you, right? And then the other option is to avoid them. I mean, so some people have used browsers, not like Google, for example, that really don't collect any of that that data about people. What is it? DuckDuck. I'm forgetting the name of it, but there are several different ones that you can find that sort of mask your identity, that don't track your personal information. They're just not the most popular and never usually the default kind of browsers, right? I was going to try to talk a little bit about, okay, I have like I'll talk 3 more minutes. I want to just at least also alert you to the way that misinformation, disinformation can happen through the fabrication and manipulation of images. So we actually saw a lot of this during the election. Some of you might have seen like, well, this particular example was very popular of a video where it looked like Joe Biden was being interviewed on TV, and it looked like he was sleeping, right? And the host on the left was saying, hey, wake up, wake up. Oh my God, he's sleeping, you know, during this interview. And it was pretty convincing. And for a lot of people, it was pretty funny, to be honest, right? So, but it was a completely fake edited video. This was actually a pretty crudely faked video. So this was a real event that happened, not with Joe Biden, but with Harry Belafonte. And so what they did was they just edited out Harry Belafonte's box, and they edited in Joe Biden's and played on a loop him looking down at notes when from a meeting that he had with somebody a long time ago. So, you know, it just goes to show. And it eventually did get that labeled as misleading. The author who put it up admitted right away that, yeah, no, this was a joke. It was just a joke. It was just a joke. So I didn't mean for it to be real. It didn't happen. But nonetheless, a lot of people did think it was real, right? Similarly, I'll do another one on the other side of the political thing. Some of you might have seen there was a video going around, an anti-Trump video that had all these moments of him edited together where he, you know, his hand was shaking when he drank a glass of water, or he was gingerly stepping downstairs, or where he verbally misspoke, or a variety of things. But of course, what happens is when you edit all those things together and take them out of context, they portray a pattern of behavior that could potentially be misleading, right? And again, and the same thing was potentially done to Joe Biden. In the future, we're going to have to really be on the lookout for things like this, deep fake technology. Some of you have probably already heard about this. This is one actually that was made by MIT. where Nicolas Cage's face was morphed onto Trump. But of course, you can imagine sort of a horrific, if it was reversed, right? If world leaders are made to be looking very convincingly like they're doing things or saying things that they're not, and it's all been kind of computer generated. So I think I want to be able to leave the rest of the time for the discussion so we can talk about what to do about this. But I want to just draw a few conclusions, right? That, we have to be kind of critical but open. We have to, when we're evaluating information, to be patient and not rush to judgment. That's very hard. So if something sounds kind of too good to believe or so crazy you can't believe it, maybe that's the moment to pause, take a deep breath, and do just a little bit of digging, right? And we all have to be kind of humble, right? We all have to be willing to revise our views in response to new evidence. And we have to be proactive, right, in getting evidence from multiple sources. Usually, if something's true, you can find it independently in several different places, right? From several different sources, not on social media. So, and we all have to be aware of our own biases. They color how we interpret information, what seems plausible to us, what seems implausible to us, and that's sort of a fact of life. And we have to learn how to identify which sources are reliable and trustworthy. I'm gonna and seek out different views from our own. These are actually some resources. These are actually a couple of different websites that you can check out when you have more time if anyone's interested. There are fact-checking websites as a way to try to address some of these problems. All Sides is actually a website that will show you for any particular story, say, for example, the 2020 election, how is it being covered by sort of a more conservative leaning newspaper or website? How is it being covered by, a centrist one? And how's it being covered by a more liberal leaning news outlet? And at the very least, by looking at like how it's being covered differently in different places, you at least get a sense of sort of the different dimensions of a particular story. Ad Fontes Media also has a media bias chart where you can look at which sources have been rated as having different kinds of political leanings, more to the left, more to the right, more centrist. And then Which Face is Real is a pretty fun website to check out if you're interested in how you can identify fake digital images that were computer generated as opposed to real photos of people. There are some clues that we can use to try to identify those. And this is a great site for learning how to do that. And I will post this in those links in the chat in case anyone is interested. And I'm also happy to make these slides available through Atticus if anybody is interested in them. But I will stop sharing and now open it up to questions, comments. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll give you guys a sec to, if you're typing stuff in the chat or anything. But I guess I have a question. So as the semester's wrapping up and we're going, everyone's going home for Thanksgiving and, maybe possibly going to see like other family members we haven't seen for a while. And so, what, like the
how to have those difficult political.
How do you have those difficult conversation with someone like at Thanksgiving table who's like spouting off some crazy information that is probably fake? Like, how do you have those sorts of conversations?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I come from an incredibly politically divided family. So I have some Trump supporters in my family. I have some Bernie Sanders supporters in my family. I have some Biden supporters in my family. I kind of have the whole political spectrum represented. And I think that you have to go into it first of all, if it's a family member that you already have a relationship with, you kind of have to go into it from a place of, caring about those people, right? I mean, you presumably care about those people, even though so one thing we can do is approach these conversations just from a place of curiosity. So why do you believe what you believe? and not assuming that the goal of the conversation is to try to set somebody straight, right? I think sometimes we would all do better if we all did a little bit more listening to each other, right? And, you know, I also think that another strategy is to start with things you agree about. So, for example, there's some great resources out there for families who have family members who believe in a conspiracy theory like QAnon or Flat Earth or whatever the case may be. And I mean, even with somebody who believes in QAnon, I mean, what I would say to that person is, you know, I think there's actually some things we agree about. You know, I mean, pedophilia, it's bad, right? I mean, that's an easy one, right? So start by acknowledging kind of areas of common ground, right? And then, you know, really trying to understand why somebody believes what they do. And, you know, you can also then share why you believe what you do. But, you know, you have to realize that these are all this is a process. These conversations are a process, and you're not likely probably to change somebody's mind immediately. But just showing someone respect, that you're willing to listen, that you care about them no matter what they think, can strengthen a relationship in a way that can make those conversations more productive, right, over time. So I saw another question in the chat. So, and let me see. So Daniel asked, do you think disinformation will get worse as time goes on and machine learning gets better? Unfortunately, yes. Yes. So this problem is actually only going to get worse, potentially. And I saw there's another question about deepfakes, which I'll get to, but deepfakes is another example. So there are tools. I mean, a lot of people who work in information technology are kind of racing to try to find signatures, find clues that can help identify when something is a fake. But the hackers and the malicious programmers are also getting better at what they do. And the algorithms that are tracking us, we're giving them more and more data. And they're learning more and more about how to predict our behavior and about how to influence our behaviors and our beliefs. And so in that context, will there ever be a time when this begins to reverse? I think the short answer is we have to really think, and it's going to take work to undo this, right? And there are some great work. If you saw the documentary, The Social Dilemma, you'll see that now there are organizations such as the Organization for Humane Technology that's trying to develop alternatives, right, that are more humane in the sense that they may not be so polarizing for us, right? So let me see. I think there was one more. So what do you think the impact of deepfakes will be in the future? So that's another one where I think the technology is likely to get better. This election cycle, interestingly, deepfakes weren't really a problem as far as I can tell. A lot of the fake or manipulated videos or photos that went around were actually not super sophisticated techniques. Deepfakes are far more dangerous because they are so convincing. So, again, and those of you that maybe are majoring in computer science and things like that, I mean, this is like a matter of, even kind of national defense, right? That we need to be able to guard against these sorts of things and them being weaponized. And I know I see that one question is about, is there any other sorts of policy that could combat this? Or do things like the First Amendment protect it? And this is a very hard question. And this is something you all as potential future policymakers, and citizens need to think about. I mean, one of the huge debates that we've been having is how should social media respond to disinformation? So some platforms like Twitter and Facebook have, to some extent, tried to red flag information they take to be false or misleading. But some people are very concerned that that gives big tech companies a lot of power to decide what's true or what's misleading. And so some people obviously feel censored, right? That they're being censored. YouTube, interestingly, they also have a policy. They had a policy against anything that was false or misleading about voting, right? And so they would take down content that instructed people to vote on a different day or whatever the heck might have been. But they're not taking down videos that are about the results of the election, because technically their policy didn't cover that. So they, who should make these decisions about what content is acceptable? Do we feel okay with tech companies making these calls? Or, because what's happening too is a lot of conservatives, just as an example, are going into, that now they're fleeing and going to different apps like Parler, right? Or these anonymous chat boards like 4chan, 8chan. And there's a worry that when that happens, we're just becoming even more fragmented and even more siloed. And so that none of this speech is kind of getting aired out and evaluated and critically evaluated. So this is, but at the same time, it can do a lot of damage. So how we strike that balance, I think, is a very difficult question. Let me go ahead. Do you want to?
Yeah, there was another one about what are your thoughts on how we can create conversations? If the internet is perhaps dividing us, what are ways that we can bring it back together?
Yeah. So so I'm come from philosophy, and there's actually a new and growing field of philosophy called virtue epistemology. And virtue epistemology is sort of aligned with virtue ethics. Maybe some of you took an intro to ethics class. But this idea that what we need to do is think about what kinds of people do we want to be? What kinds of knowers do we want to be? What sort of traits do we want to cultivate? Are there certain character traits that are potentially, sort of more helpful for addressing these kind of problems? And I mentioned a few of them briefly, right? Like humility, a lack of dogmatism. So kind of like being willing to admit that you could be wrong, or being kind of open-minded. Creativity, right? Curiousness. So just being curious about what other people think and why, right? But I do think that there's a deeper question about what could we, and this is, I think, kind of what Mark was, or no, what the person who wrote, I now lost it in the thread of the chat, but the person who asked that question said, how can we kind of, have that improved culture of conversation? And it really is about trying to encourage each other to have conversations where you're not just trying to show somebody's wrong and here's why, but that's interesting. Why do you think what you think, right? And one of the things I asked my students this semester is if they have any friends, and not family, because family, sometimes we don't get to pick, right? But friends who think completely differently than them, who have different political views than them. And there was like 2 out of 16, right? So another thing that we can try to do is try to cultivate friendships with diverse thinking people. And those relationships don't have to be based on what it is you disagree about, right? They can be based on other things that you have in common. But they can help us understand that people who think differently, that have different values, are not bad people in a way that may make us open. There was a lovely story in the New York Times about 2 voters in Missouri. One who was a Joe Biden supporter and one who's a Trump supporter. And they were both pretty avid supporters, right, of their people, and really thought the other guy was the devil incarnate. But they had lunch together every Tuesday, right? Except for a brief time during the lockdown. And, they just talk, and they talk about their differences, and they respect each other, even though they don't agree. But they don't try to agree. They just try to understand. And so I found that to be kind of a hopeful story in these otherwise somewhat depressing times, and I think it's a good thing that we could all try, even on an individual level.
Yeah, for sure. So we had another question. Is there any way to curb disinformation without stomping on free speech in the internet? Which I think you already addressed a little bit, but I was wondering if you have a more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I do think it's tricky. I think, so there are some people who, do kind of have these kind of content-based restrictions. So flagging and fact checking and that kind of thing. There's another potential, I mean, some of the fact checking, there's different things. There's also crowdsourcing fact checking. So leaving it up to people to comment to explain why some of that's problematic. The problem is when we have social media accounts that can be made automatic, that makes it hard, because then you get thousands of comments and like who's going to read through all that. But another option is to be able to for yourself anyway, encourage, look at things like that, all sides, which at least kind of gives you sort of these different perspectives in a way that doesn't censor any of them, but puts some of it in context. And I mean, I think there's other questions. I mean, the other thing we can do is change the technology so that we don't get so tracked and siloed into particular groups, which also might, might make it that some of this is kind of fact checked without being censored, or at least, discussed without being censored.
Yeah. That's an interesting thought. So we have another question. Do you think that trends like the Dame Dunny deepfake meme inadvertently raise awareness about deepfakes and had some sort of preventative effect against potential malicious deepfake attempts?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. So one thing is, knowing about deepfakes, I think there's a good question about, is this helpful or harmful? So on the one hand, it can be good because it can raise awareness, right, about what's possible in a way that alerts people so that they can kind of guard against it, or at least be aware, okay, if I see a video of the politician I hate doing like something that would destroy their career, before I get super excited about it, let me see if it's real. But at the same time, I mean, I think a lot of journalists are in kind of a really difficult bind. There's debates among a lot of journalists about to what extent do they cover certain false claims, or to what extent do they even talk about charges of fake news. Because in some ways, even in criticizing it, you're repeating it and you're giving it a little bit more life in a way that might give it more traction. So another kind of cognitive bias is the more times we hear something, the more it's likely to stick with us. And so there's this kind of dilemma, right, about does bringing so much attention to these problems also reinforce them in a certain way? And I think that's a really if I were in the media, I'm not sure what I would do about that. But you can tell that a lot of them struggle with that.
And I guess to kind of go off of that, with something scientifically settled, like climate change, for instance, how can we have, and it's also, given the scientific consensus, very pressing, how can we, one, facilitate productive conversations on that, and two, how do we make everybody feel like they're being included without making it seem like a balanced issue when there's a scientific consensus on one side?
So I think this is another area that I'm really interested in. What do we do in cases where a significant portion of society kind of rejects a claim that's widely accepted among scientists or scientific, experts? And we're now seeing examples of that with the pandemic as well, right? Whether it's mask wearing or the efficacy or safety of a vaccine, you see instances where people are calling into question or appear to call into question the science. So I think we need a twofold strategy for addressing that. Well, maybe even threefold strategy. So number one, I do think we need to have more public engagement about how science works. Not like trying to, I think it's, not realistic to think that we can make everyone an expert in everything, because that's not likely to happen. But, for example, people, so for example, people accuse Anthony Fauci as changing his position multiple times on masks. First, we were told, don't wear masks, and then we were told to wear masks, and we were told, well, wear them for other people. Now we're being told, no, wear them for yourself, right? And so you might think, oh, like this, so the scientists don't know. They don't know what the heck they're talking about. But of course, that's an example not of a contradiction so much as, you know, science is a process where we're constantly getting new information and we're revising our views, you know, in response to new evidence, right? So I think number one, kind of having a better sense about how science works can be important. But on the other hand, I also think, and I think climate change may be an example of this. So there are certainly people who call into question very basic claims like anthropogenic climate change is happening and will likely have catastrophic consequences. But most climate skeptics, there's a whole different range of climate skeptics. And some of them will say, no, I get it. I get average global temperatures increasing. I get a lot of it's probably due to human activity, but I just think that the Green New Deal, for example, is too costly. I worry it won't do enough to address climate change, and I worry that it will cost us X, Y, or Z, energy, jobs, whatever, you know, fill in the blank. So if you notice, some of our disagreements are actually not about the science, but about values. So with masks, I mean, it's interesting, you know, I listened when the Gallatin County Board of Health debated the mask mandate. And there were some people that tried to bring scientific studies showing that there were risks to wearing masks or that they weren't effective. However, there were other people that it wasn't that they didn't believe the science, it was that they just thought the government shouldn't be able to tell me what I do with my body, right? Even if this would help other people, I have a right not to do it. And, you know, that's a value claim. And so what we need is actually to have a value debate, right? We need to like engage and, you know, identify some of the values that we have that are underlying our policy choices or our personal decisions about behavior, and really critically think about whether they're reasonable and whether there's some shared values. There's a great video out there by a very, very conservative woman who's very, very for things like climate change policies. And she says, look, the way you got to talk to conservatives about policies is, you know, free market policies that address climate change and energy independence and energy freedom and, you know, protecting our outdoors and, you know, doing all these kind of things that might appeal to values that we share so that you can get a consensus around certain climate policies by appealing to the things that people care about. And they did that actually in Alaska. There was a great campaign that was the result of a technique called deep organizing that was done by the National Wilderness Association. We have the Montana Wilderness Association here. And they just went out and knocked on people's doors, not because there was an election, not because they were asking people to do stuff, but just to talk to neighbors and find out, what do you care about? Why do you, what makes the environment important to you? And they basically just kind of got all this data from people about what people cared about. And they found that the one issue that unified people on the left and the right, people who were like big sport, you know, fishermen and hunters and indigenous people in Alaska and a variety, you know, all these groups that you would think they don't have anything in common. They all care about salmon, right? And they care about protecting salmon and salmon habitats, and they care about it for different reasons, right? But by doing that, you kind of figure out where's that common ground where we can make a policy change that we can get, you know, huge support. And they did it in Alaska. They passed a policy protecting salmon and salmon habitats that way.
That's super cool to that, because I have a bunch of friends who live up in Alaska. We have a question now from Dr. Lee, who's wondering, since music is so often a subscript in videos and campaign rallies and other things, in the sense that it tells us what to think, and have you had time to like explore music in terms of that?
Yeah, it was such a great question, Elsa Marie. So, you know, I mean, I think that for music, music evokes emotion so deeply in so many of us, which is presumably why it's used. I mean, I think, you know, if you watched a campaign commercial without the music, it would not be the same, right? But you watch it with the music and you feel this like soaring hope or whatever, oftentimes it can be incredibly powerful. And so again, these are one of the potential biases though, like evoking those emotional triggers is what can push us in certain directions. And so I hope that means we don't have to do away with music, because it's probably the only good thing about campaign commercials. but I think we have to be aware of when those buttons are being pushed in us in very deliberate ways, and whether, we want to be pushed that way.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And so it is 5 o'clock, and so if you have to go, we posted the Text and Critics link. You can get your credit there. We have one other question, which was, could tightening the ability to make bot accounts prevent the spreading of fake news? And if so, like, how would we go about doing that?
Yeah, definitely. So, and there have been some attempts to do that. I mean, I think Facebook shut down, what was it? I mean, it was thousands of bot accounts during the election season. So they are getting better at catching some of these and eliminating those accounts. And certainly that helps. But it's a little bit like playing whack-a-mole, right? That others spring up. They can be very difficult to identify. The fact that there's, one way you used to be able to catch some of those like fake accounts pretty quickly was by doing like a reverse image search and seeing that the photo that somebody had posted as their account really belonged or came from somewhere else. But now that we have things like computer generated images, that's becoming harder. So it's, so that's one thing we need to kind of try to keep on top of and try to keep, working towards reining in. But, we shouldn't fool ourselves. It's a challenging thing. And unfortunately, I mean, there's a lot of different actors out there that actually have many different intentions, but a lot of them do want to just sow doubt, confusion, conflict, chaos for whatever their own purposes are. So on that happy note.
Yeah, I guess as we wrap up, do you have any final closing thoughts for us to take away from this? Go into the next month of our lives, the rest of our lives after this.
I'm asking myself the same question. But, I think, so if we kind of go back to some of those last things, I mean, I do think we have to kind of be patient. I do think we have to kind of see what comes out of, it seems pretty clear that in a lot of states where the election was very close, that everything is being gone through with a kind of fine-tooth comb. So a lot of concerns that have been risen about the election either have been shown to be unfounded. So like, for example, in some states, Nevada, for example, they presented a list of dead people who had potentially voted, or people who weren't living in the state as evidence for election. And every single one of those names got investigated. And sadly, many of them actually turned out to be military members. So sometimes people look like they have two addresses because they have their military address and then they have their other address. And you can indeed vote in Nevada if you're on an Air Force base in California, and you can vote in your Nevada home. Or in some cases where somebody was dead, they found out that the father and the son had the same name. And so it was the son who had voted and the father did not vote. It just got recorded wrong in the voter rolls. So these things are being investigated. I'd like to say that I have faith in the system as a whole, that we will all have confidence in the results. It seems pretty clear that so far there's no evidence for any kind of widespread fraud or anything that would overturn election results. But, we have to be patient. We have to be open-minded. We have to be, regardless of which side we're on, whether it be Republican, Democrat, we have to, be prepared for evidence to change our minds, right? That maybe what we thought happened or didn't think happened, or vice versa. And try to keep open about that. But it's hard because we also just want to move on, right? We just want to move on. Oh, so.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really one. Yeah, We really
Well,
appreciate
thanks
it.
so much for having me. I always love doing honors events. I hope to come back and be able to do a seminar in Honors College soon again. So
We would love that. We would love that, Dr. Intemann, and the Ethicats. If you ever feel the need to bring that student organization forward, you'll have an army of students signing up.
Great. Well, I love to hear about it. Yes, yeah. This year was kind of a rough year with because of the pandemic, but each fall I do try to put together a team of debaters that are the Ethicats to debate in the Northwest Regional Ethics Bowl. We debate tons of real life ethical cases, and that's actually another example that gives me hope, because I've often had students on those teams that had completely divergent political views, and they became such good friends through that experience. And so that also makes me hopeful. You all make me hopeful.
Yes. That's something to look forward to. I'm sure all these students, I'm sure there are tens of students on this call. That's it. Next year, I'll do it. Thank you, Chris.
Feel free to contact me. And yeah, if anyone wants to follow up and chat about any of this, we have some students who are writing blog posts for the Initiative for Science, Technology, Ethics, and Society, and 2 of them are writing on issues related to disinformation and fake news, and those will probably get posted within the next 2 weeks. So yeah, feel free to come check out our initiative if anybody's interested in these topics.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much. And once again, feel free to send honorspresents@montana.edu an email if you have any questions or want to get in contact, or Dr. Intamann's contact is up on the MSU webpage as well. So yeah, thank you guys so much for coming, and have a great rest of your night and rest of your semester.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe and healthy and sane at the end of the semester. Take care.
Take care. All right.